Okja is a 2017 film directed by Joon-ho. Lucy Mirando, the CEO of Mirando Corporation, announces a new super pig. 26 specimens are sent across the world. One such super pig, Okja, has lived with a young girl named Micha and her grandfather for the past 10 years. The Mirando Corporation comes to collect Okja, but Micha does not want to give her away. With the help of the Animal Liberation Front, Micha travels to America to rescue Okja. The ALF wants to use this as an opportunity to expose the inhumane treatment of the super pigs by the Mirando Corporation. After a series of mishaps and false starts, they manage to broadcast the cruelty of the corporation, and Micha escapes with Okja and another baby super pig. There are other movies and television shows in which a child tries to save their pet from some villain who inexplicably wants to capture or kill the pet, but in Okja, the concept becomes political and is examined in such a way that it brings to mind actual non-human animal ethics. In philosophy, what we typically call animals are referred to as non-human animals so that no biased distinction between the animal status of Homo sapiens and the animal status of other creatures can exist. Ethics related to non-human animals generally follow along the path of this question. Is there something distinctive about humans that justifies the belief that we have moral status and non-human animals do not? In philosophical circles, an entity has moral status only if it or its interests morally matter to some degree for the entity's own sake. Generally speaking, society grants moral status to all human beings, but historically societies have at times denied moral status to foreigners, racial minorities, women, the physically or mentally disabled, and others. This denial has not only happened legally, but socially, meaning a society has deemed a group of people as less than human and therefore not worthy of moral status. A slave, for example, is not granted true moral status, meaning the slave's feelings and interests are not taken into any real consideration except as they pertain to the slave's owner. But Okja is about the moral status of non-human animals. Okja, as a pig, is not granted legal status by South Korea or America, but Micha does not see it that way. She believes Okja is worthy of moral status, meaning moral consideration for the pig's feelings and interests. Early in the film, Okja saves the young girl's life, suggesting that Okja values the life of Micha and therefore life itself. A pet dog can be similarly protective of its human owner. Those with moral status are sometimes called moral persons. Determining an entity's moral status as a moral person is tricky and will often be met with resistance if the non-moral status of an entity has previously been concluded by a majority in society. Is Okja a moral person? Meaning, does she have moral status? For philosophers, that depends on how one judges full moral status. As said, Okja saves Micha. If the capacity to value life were a sufficient ground for having a high degree of moral status, then under what is called threshold conception, Okja would be a moral person. If the capacity to value grounds moral status, then any entity that has this capacity, regardless of how often or how well it utilizes it, has the same moral status as any other being with this capacity. To put in layman's terms, if Okja desires to save the life of Micha, even once, then it can be considered under moral considerations, even if the super pig never exhibits this towards others. Under scalar conception, Okja has not necessarily attained moral status. Scalar conception highlights the importance of how often and/or how well one can exhibit or exercise a capacity. In this case, to value life. Okja is seen as caring for a super pig that is not her own, suggesting she may meet the criteria for scalar conception as well. Common ethical debates related to non-human animals include the treatment of livestock, such as raising calves, specifically for veal, and burning the beaks off chickens. The management of wild animals, such as killing in response to overpopulation, and the management of zoos and other non-human animal habitats. In Okja, the most obvious moral debate is over the slaughter and consumption of the world's non-human animals. Some people choose not to eat non-human animals for dietary reasons or ethical reasons. Among the most common ethical choice related to this is the belief that non-human animals have at least some degree of moral status. The ethics of the treatment of non-human animals started to gain steam in the 20th century, popularized in part by philosopher Peter Singer. He believed that the moral status of non-human animals could be easily solved by the fact that they have their own self-interests, because they can experience pain and would wish to avoid it. How far down the evolutionary scale shall we go? To answer these questions, we must bear in mind the central principle on which our concern for other beings is based. The only legitimate boundary to our concern for the interests of other beings is the point at which it is no longer accurate to say that the other being has interests. To have interests, in a strict non-metaphorical sense, a being must be capable of suffering or experiencing pleasure. The fact that the film's non-human animal character is a pig is rather telling. Most films in which the animal is in danger is a cat or a dog. In other words, non-human animals with whom most Western audiences would consider their deaths to be abhorrent due to our close relationships with them. But morally speaking, what is the difference between a dog that many societies do not eat and a pig that many societies do eat? Does human familiarity with a dog or a cat somehow grant those creatures greater consideration, and if so, why? When we watch Mija desperately trying to protect her pet, Okja, do we feel for Okja and even consider its moral status, or are we really only sympathizing with the feelings of Mija, a human whose moral status is not in question? Does the fact that Okja is a pet grant it greater consideration, and again, if so, why? When we hear about humans who participate in dogfights, we are naturally concerned, but why do we not share the same concerns for chickens or cows? Questions like these need to be answered in a satisfactory way with no noticeable contradictions, or else said answer is meaningless, at least to philosophers. How do we morally reconcile our own desire to avoid pain, injury, and death with how we allow this to happen to non-human animals? Singer and others would say that while there are obvious differences between ourselves and non-human animals, intelligence for one, there are no morally relevant differences. In other words, differences that make the morality of treating one entity unlike the morality of treating another entity. Such beliefs are held by many modern philosophers as well as groups like the Animal Liberation Front in the film. The Animal Liberation Front, for the uninitiated, is not an invention of the film. It exists in the real world. In the film, when the members speak of taking all precautions against harming both humans and non-human animals, that is in keeping with their real-world philosophy. Though opponents classify them as terrorists, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ALF has never actually killed anyone. So what reasons are used as justifications for the treatment and consumption of non-human animals? One is the intelligence defense. Humans are noticeably more intelligent than non-human animals. Mija and every other human character in the film is undoubtedly more intelligent than Okja or any of the other super pigs. That is not to say they have no ability to think. They are able to problem solve at least as much as any real-world non-human animal, but they are not portrayed as having comparable intelligence to a human. But that defense has a hole in it. Most humans would not remove moral status from another human just because said human is less intelligent than others. It is unthinkable that someone would deem it morally acceptable to murder someone because they believed the victim's IQ was 1 point lower than their own. The mass murder of the mentally handicapped has historical precedent and is widely considered monstrous. And if that is true, why would it be morally acceptable to treat members of another species badly based on the same criteria? This is what I mean when I say morally relevant reasons. If intelligence is not morally relevant to a human's moral status, then it has no bearing on the treatment of non-human animals either. A superiority defense states that human beings climbed to the top of the food chain, and that gives us the right to treat non-human animals as we please. The Morando Corporation can be seen as a representative of this way of thinking. They are on top. Everyone else is on the bottom. That alone is justification for their behavior. Yet, one cannot help but notice some bias there. If we were suddenly not on top, we would obviously not think this as a valid defense. If another species on Earth suddenly came to control us, we would probably abandon our food chain defense pretty quickly. Superiority defense also carries with it some obvious historical baggage, and if one does not believe a technologically superior culture has the right to invade and slaughter a technologically inferior culture, then this defense as it relates to non-human animals begins to fall apart. Protestations of, "but these are humans, not animals," is a common reaction, but again, it is only culturally relevant, not morally relevant. What if the moral status of Okja itself is irrelevant to the philosopher? It might be to some utilitarian philosophers, as that system of ethics is about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Some utilitarians would claim that the amount of overall pleasure on Earth is greater when humans dominate non-human animals for food, clothing, cosmetics, and other things, because the increase in pleasure is greater than the increase in pain. However, that is incredibly difficult to quantify, and it contains clear bias in favor of humans. It should be noted that Peter Singer and 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham were both utilitarians and clearly rejected such an idea. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty for discourse? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any other sensitive being? We are all the same in the sense that we all wish to avoid suffering and death. Okja is captured, made to suffer, and prepared for slaughter. Why is Okja's suffering acceptable and ours is not? Other justifications include religion, but supernatural justifications are famously difficult to resolve. Philosophers like Singer and Bentham would say that we must equally consider the interests of non-human animals, if only because we have no morally relevant justification that can stand up to scrutiny. At the end of the film, we get a kind of bittersweet happy ending. Okja is saved, and Mija lives with her in peace, but the film can only be so optimistic. Okja is allowed to leave only because of another character's greed, and the other super pigs remain behind to be slaughtered. It would be dishonest to portray the conclusion any other way. Regardless of whether one routinely considers non-human animals as having moral status, philosophy requires consistency of belief, and the manner in which humans justify treatment of non-human animals contains external inconsistencies in society and internal inconsistencies in the individual, and for that reason alone, it cannot go unexamined. Hi everyone. If you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also how you can request an episode. There are also a lot of other perks for being a patron, so check it out. The information is on my Patreon page. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next week.